power on.
Hey, if you have a project that needs reliable cryptocurrency data, check out blocktap.io. Blocktap.io is a universal cryptocurrency API. You can get historical prices for Bitcoin and other digital assets that you can use to build charts and do market analysis. Blockchain data is also indexed, so you can get transaction statistics, address balances, and more for Bitcoin and other networks. Blocktap.io is free for personal use, and you don't even need to create an account to access the API. To get started, try some of the example queries on the homepage at blocktap.io. Again, that's blocktap.io, blocktap.io, and we thank them for sponsoring Sovryn Tech. Woo, let's get back to the show.
Accessing historical database. Year 2020. The tech giants become aware of the greatest threat to their corporatist domination. An obscure science and tech podcast becomes a major factor in a peaceful open source revolt against the military Silicon Valley industrial complex. The podcast, Sovryn Tech. Its host, Dr. Brian Sovryn. The tech giants tried to stop Sovryn Tech. They can't.
Woo, coming in hotter than a Chicago album, baby. I'm not kidding about that. It is the Golden Stallion, the man of tomorrow, Savzu, the rated R radio star. Boy, speaking of something coming in hot, I've been listening to this book. It's relatively new. Actually, it might have just come out recently, but it's by Dr. Joseph Mercola. It's called EMF'd, as in, electromagnetic field, but then F'd, as in fucked. Love it. What a brilliant title for a book. But it's called EMF'd, and the subtitle is 5G, Wi-Fi, and cell phones, hidden harms and how to protect yourself. We talked about, quite a few episodes ago, I know it was in 2019, when we talked about concerns, or we shared concerns about 5G and what that could end up looking like when it gets more implemented. This book, I'll tell you what I started out listening to, not fun, not fun at all. I mean, and I called bullshit really more from a privacy perspective on 5G, not so much of a health perspective. But I'll tell you, one of the top things coming out of this book is that apparently there has been no health studies about 5G done. I mean, just none. Now, we could get into whether or not it's even practical to pull off something like that. But, there are claims as to why. Well, for example, the FCC, regulates Wi-Fi routers you got to understand this. Wi-Fi routers could actually have significantly more range than they do. But the FCC regulates them down to a certain level. Now, we could get into whether or not their concerns, the FCC's concerns as to why Wi-Fi routers are basically running at half mast. In fact, that's being generous. We could get into why that is, and it may not so much have to do with health concerns, but more with how it interrupts or interferes with other, EMF or with other bands, right? And maybe that's more the concern there. But there have been almost no studies on what 5G does to the human body, or to say much of anything else. And I think that's a problem, so the health concerns around this, that's certainly an area that I haven't spent a whole ton of time on, but I am now while reading this book. I definitely recommend you check it out. Of course, I might get to the end of it and say, oh, this is nonsense. I mean, so I'd heard about this book from another podcast, and some of the tech recommendations. I mean, look, folks, you can't, people can try to be polymaths today, but you can't be a polymath today to where like you just fucking know everything. I mean, I try, and believe me, I try, but it's just not possible. And some of the recommendations that I'd heard Dr. Mercola make, for example, on the podcast, I think I initially heard him talking on, in fact, this will get into, we really don't have a whole ton to get into in the Foreplay. But he recommended not using Google Chrome. Now, the reason he recommended not using Google Chrome, and part of it was a broader concern around Google itself, Google being a monopoly. I mean, look, and I get it. These guys can't. So it was all right. I mean, I'll just open right up with it. It was Ben Greenfield's podcast, which I enjoy, and we've talked about some of Ben Greenfield's things that he's discussed on his podcast. Sometimes we've called BS on what he's said, anyway, in this, whatever, Ben Greenfield and Dr. Mercola. I mean, tech or varying aspects of tech, maybe more on the consumer side, aren't exactly, might not be their specialty, or their 100% forte, right? For example, again, Dr. Mercola was recommending, use the Brave browser. Now, I don't have too much against the Brave browser. I mean, their basic attention token and things like this, I run into issues there. Brave uses Chromium. I prefer that people use browsers that even get away from that engine. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. Okay. But Dr. Mercola has a problem with using Chrome or from using a Google product overall. Now, I share that sentiment. I mean, it's one of my most famous sayings, and it's 2 words, fuck Google, right? I say that all the time. But his reasoning was, and this is going to get into kind of a contradiction, in my opinion. I mean, look, Ben Greenfield, very smart guy. Dr. Mercola, very smart guy. And I'm not going to take anything away from that. And I think that they both do tremendous work overall. Okay. So, you could say I'm nitpicking here, but not exactly. I mean, I want to bring some reality to this in this discussion that they made that they had, because I imagine it might be in either one of their books. Cause I think Ben Greenfield, I haven't listened to it yet. It's a 41-hour opus. Ben Greenfield came out with a book too called Boundless. And we've got great stories to get into, folks, stuff that plays off of our most recent episode, which got a lot of response from that, arguing that perhaps the internet as we know it is a singular living organism. Woo. And perhaps sapient. Oh my. Anyway, we're just laying out the theories, folks, and, potential evidence for such, that not necessarily drawing a conclusion, but regardless, so he's saying stay away from Google. Again, I think that's fine advice. But his reasoning for that and to not use Chrome is because he's claiming, and I don't think he's wrong, he's claiming that Google, the search engine, is basically it is filtering out, if you are like, say, an anti-vaccine person, or if you have recommendations, alternative medical recommendations that I guess would get chalked up to fake news or something along those lines, that Google will filter you out, and that his site and other sites of import have been filtered out. In fact, in the podcast, he and Ben are, kind of joking back and forth that, Ben better not talk about something because otherwise he'll end up getting, filtered out of Google, and blocked from showing up in Google's search. And I think the search engine they recommended was Quant. I don't have a problem with Quant, really. Of course, I generally recommend DuckDuckGo, but regardless, so using Chrome is not going to keep you from getting to, at least not yet, is not going to keep you from getting to these varying alternative, or if you want to call them this, alternative health or lifestyle websites. I mean, not using Chrome. Now, using the Google search engine, I think he's absolutely right about that. So you don't want to use the Google search engine, but then that's not new news on Sovryn Tech. We've been saying that forever. But look, folks, you can use a Chromebook, okay? And there's an argument for using a Chromebook, all right? It is not a private platform, but it is a secure as fuck platform. If you listen to Zomi 1 Underground Q&As, we recently got a question about Chromebooks, and I broke it down and I said, hey, if you're traveling, I mean, it's a no-brainer in many ways to use one of those as basically like a burner laptop, more or less. And there are plenty of other security professionals who would recommend the same, even though they would also tell you, don't you dare use Google's products overall, or use their search or things like this because, for privacy concerns. But on a security aspect, granted, you can't really have 100%. I mean, you can never really have 100% security, but you can't even have 90% security without privacy, right? But you can have in as far as like being out in the wild, and especially if you're at airports and other places, I mean, a Chromebook becomes, an attractive option. But if you want to hear more of that, listen to recent Zomi 1 Underground Q&A episodes. And of course, if you want to become a member of the Zomi 1 Underground, just go to Zomia 1, that's ZOMIAONE.com. Go to Zomi1.com and sign up on the right-hand side. But here's the thing. So even on a Chromebook, you can change what the Omnibar, even though Google still records everything that's in the Omnibar, that's in the terms of service, by the way. And it's always been that way since Chrome first came out, which is just the Omnibar is their fancy term for the address bar where you type in, Zomia1.com, right? But you could set that to DuckDuckGo. You could set it to any search engine you want. In fact, DuckDuckGo is one of the default options where you don't have to custom enter, the search engine. It used to be you had to custom enter in DuckDuckGo. And actually you can set up DuckDuckGo to, a certain way to where it has a very specific URL with your settings. And you could put that in there, and that's a really great option. But regardless, DuckDuckGo is there, and you could use that instead of the Google search engine. Chrome, as it stands right now, and I'm being very particular in saying that statement, as it stands right now, because I could certainly see a scenario where in the future, Chrome itself as a web browser, and this might speak to our kind of our first little bit in the foreplay, as a web browser could absolutely control where, what URLs you are allowed to go to. I mean, web browsers for years now, all except for Firefox, the major web browsers have all toyed, I think even Safari was doing this, have all toyed with the notion of getting rid of the address bar, right? Where you don't even see it. And, what do you put there in place where you don't see half the code or whatever else? Well, that's what they were testing out. But regardless, that was a thing. But this recommendation of don't use Chrome because our sites with very important information. And I would agree that I think there's some very important information. I mean, I looked at Dr. Mercola's website. I think there's tremendous stuff on there. Go down the list. Some of these, alternative medicine, shall we say, websites, I think are actually fantastic, or like natural alternative sites and all stuff. I think they're wonderful. But Chrome's not going to stop you from getting to those. The Google search engine might, yes. I don't doubt that for a second. Okay, but Chrome won't stop that. So, there was that recommendation that I thought was a little odd. And what's contradictory about it is that he starts tearing into in this podcast, and I'm sure he's going to get into it in his book EMF'd, which I still recommend. Don't use Google because Google has a monopoly. Look, Google is not, yes, fuck Google, but Google's not the company to be worried about. The company to be worried about is Amazon, right? As we have predicted long before any other journalistic institution ever bothered to talk about Amazon as being a scary prospect, which they are. But then Dr. Mercola is probably not going to he's not going to tell you to not use Amazon, right? If he's concerned about Google for reasons, any reason you're concerned about Google, you should equally be concerned about Amazon. But then if you tell people not to go to Amazon, guess what? His book's not going to get sold, right? So he's not going to recommend what hurts his pocketbook. And I'm not knocking him. I mean, look, we all have our tolerances. We all, whatever we got to do to survive in this world, I understand. Okay. But I'm just saying, to make the big ethical argument against Google, baby, you got to make that ethical argument against, the entire Sinister Six. Every single Amazon is the tech giant, as I have said for years before anybody else made that claim. They are the tech giant. You can't be worried about Google, Apple, whatever smartphone company, Samsung, Facebook. I mean, we can go down the whole Sinister Six, as we call them here. Okay. Amazon's one of them, and they are the biggest. They are the monopoly, and they are becoming more and more of a monopoly all the time. So I thought that was a little incongruous, kind of hypocritical, dare I say, to not bother to mention the concern around Amazon. But again, that's going to hit all these guys in the pocketbook. I mean, even me, look, I'll call it out, I'll be frank with you. Even me, this book, I could not find it on some of my favorite public library websites like audiobookbay.nl. Hooray for torrents. I had to get it to listen to it on Audible. There it is. I had to get it on Audible. Of course, Audible is an Amazon company. Now, I mean, I can play the mental gymnastics and say, well, I've had my Audible account since before Amazon owned it, and it's not my fault that Amazon bought it out or whatever, but that's mental gymnastics on my part as well. So, but point being is that that's the way you consume, I don't know what the numbers are. We talked recently. There's a couple episodes ago when we were talking about ebooks in general and how they're not that big a part of the market, right? That ebooks are only 20% of book sales, regardless of what the rest of the percentages. And I don't know even if those book stats counted audiobooks, because I bet audiobooks are cutting into if that's part of the 100% of book sales, I bet audiobooks are cutting in a pretty big number. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if audiobooks sold more than ebooks. Like these days, I could totally believe that. Regardless, ebooks, print books, audiobooks, whatever way you get your books, I bet if you looked at the statistics for that, again, not just the statistics of what type of books people buy, are they ebooks or paper books, but just like, what books are sold where, you're probably going to end up with, I wouldn't be surprised if it was anywhere 70 to 80% of books, regardless of type, are sold via Amazon, right? I mean, that. So, if you want to sell books, like Amazon's the place. I mean, even me, I write books and they're almost exclusively available on Amazon for varying reasons. There's ways that the way their terms of service works where that has to happen. But regardless, let's be clear on that. Most people get books through Amazon. I'm glad there's still independent booksellers out there. I'm glad that, Barnes and Noble, screw them too, but they're out there. And hey, look, I support Barnes and Noble as well. I'm a BNN member, right? I have my membership. So yeah, I'm there for it, but let's be honest about this. And so I was a little disappointed that, and we'll see what happens. And I'll probably do a review of this book and talk about it more when I'm done, because again, a lot of what I'm hearing is very concerning. And I'm to the point that, wherever I end up, like in my dream home, there would be no Wi-Fi, and I sure as fuck wouldn't have a smartphone either. But regardless, I'll talk about that more as I end up finishing this book. And I'm a good chunk into it, but it's worthwhile. But I'm curious to see what the recommendations are. And if he doesn't call out Amazon in all of this, because Amazon's setting up, like he also brought up how, the health concerns around 5G. And he brought up how, Elon Musk is setting up Starlink, which that's going to put, 5G fucking everywhere, around the entire planet. And the concerns around that. But that's not even getting into and we've covered this, right? Was it Sidewalk? Is that I think that's the frequency, the band that Ring and Amazon, of course, same company now, but that they are using to create it's to create an alternative internet in its own way, which we talked about, it was maybe 5-6 episodes ago on Sovryn Tech. But it is definitely being used to allow Amazon devices and Ring devices to communicate with each other. But they're laying it out, and their plan is to lay out their routers. I think it's Sidewalk, that they plan on laying all that out, 700 at least of these devices, pure municipality. And so if you're not, again, you gotta rip on Amazon. And it's so ironic, right? Imagine ripping on Amazon in a book that, is probably, again, 80% getting sold, 80% profits are coming from selling it in one form or fashion through Amazon. So Anyway, there it is. But, we're talking about browsers, so I want to get into that because ultimately I'm glad that Dr. Mercola and Ben Greenfield, brought up talking about using alternative web browsers, because right now, and I think the signs are out there, and we're going to get into a matter of fact that I think proves the point. Okay. And I've been saying this for a couple of years now. In fact, I think maybe the last time I really talked about it was when Opera came out with their quote unquote gaming web browser, which I actually thought was brilliant because it allowed you to, in the browser, throttle the resources that the browser would use. It's called Opera GX, right? Which it'll let you throttle how much RAM the browser uses and how much CPU the browser uses. That way, when you're gaming and you have your browser open at the same time, your browser, which can definitely be a fucking resource hog. I mean, just look at Chrome. Okay. And, well, I mean, and not that Firefox is necessarily that much better as far as resource hog. But regardless, I mean, they will definitely use up resources to where it could probably affect your gaming if you're going for that perfect pixel, right? And the master or the PC master race certainly are those type to do so. And I mean, hey, rock and roll. But I'd said then when that came out, the browser wars are not over. I mean, everybody thinks, well, everybody uses Chrome. No, not really. And in fact, I think the browser wars heated up, and I think Google is sweating it a bit. Once Microsoft finally, which they did in January of this year of 2020, they finally, they brought what gets called Credge, as in Microsoft Edge, but Chromium-based Microsoft Edge instead of being based off of the Edge HTML engine. That came out of beta in January 2020. And I wonder if a lot of people were just like, hey, wow, this is cool. I'll check this out. Now, and I'll explain why we know Google is sweating a bit about this. Okay. But what happened, Microsoft really, they took the first shot. Okay. And this isn't new for Microsoft. They've been doing this with Windows 10 for a while, where in Windows, and there's a setting where you can turn this off. In fact, I wrote a blog post on Medium. I guess now that's a couple of years ago, but regardless, I wrote a blog post on Medium about how you can turn some of these things off. But whatever app or software that you ended up using for, I don't know if you used mail software or something like that, basically Windows 10 would know that you were using Thunderbird, I guess, or just at varying times. Maybe it's not even when you'd open up, a piece of software, but Microsoft would be recommending, hey, you should use Windows 10 Mail, or hey, you should use Calendar, or hey, you should use Edge. And that's what they've been doing even more so now. They've doubled down. Now you can turn those messages off, but then they came back recently, ever since Credge came out, right? Chromium-based Edge, that's Credge. When that came out, suddenly, like if you open Firefox, you would get a message that would say, and there's a way to turn this off too, but you would get a message that would come up and say, hey, why don't you use Edge? Now, here's the thing. I kind of get if you were using Chrome, if you're using Google Chrome, maybe if you're using Opera, even though I think this would still be true. If you're using anything other than Chrome, I think you're using it very intentionally. And it's because it's something you're doing for very good reasons. You're using Firefox for very good reasons. You're using even Opera for very good reasons, or Vivaldi for very good reasons, or even Brave, I guess, for very good reasons, right? It's not like anybody that's installed another browser besides Chrome is probably a person that knows, oh yeah, no, Edge is out there. Okay. Yeah, and I don't want to use it. So it feels really stupid for Microsoft to somehow recommend, hey, you should check out Edge. Now, look, I think there's an argument, and I've made the argument for why in fact, I made the argument before Credge existed of why you should use Edge. And that is, it's what's known as what I call software or app minimalism, or even account minimalism. Those two cross paths a lot, and they're both my concepts, okay, or Sovryn tech concepts. The less accounts that you have, the more secure you are. Online accounts of any kind, whatever. I mean, opening a Firefox account, not that you need to have an account to use Firefox. You do need to more or less have have an account, or I mean, Chrome will bother the fuck out of you if you don't create a Google account. But yeah, and there's features within Chrome you can't use if you don't have a Chrome account. That's not true with Firefox. With Firefox, you can basically use every feature, without creating an account, which kudos to that. Okay. But whatever account you can imagine, or a Facebook account or a Twitter account. Okay. You want as few of those as possible. Now, having as few of those as possible does not mean that any site you go to that allows you to log in with Facebook or Google, that you want to log in with Facebook or Google. I would argue, no, you don't want to do that. Okay. But that's another story. That's not what we're here to talk about. But the fewer accounts you have and the less software that you install is the less amount of attack vectors that you have on, whatever device you happen to be using. Okay. So, the less web browsers you have installed, that's one less web browser that can end up getting cracked into by a bad actor. Okay. Or being used as for injections or whatever else. So using Edge, I mean, from a security standpoint, is actually a good idea. I mean, from a privacy standpoint, Microsoft's collecting who knows what, right? But then if you're already using Windows anyway, Microsoft's already, probably, or at the very least, we know they can track all telemetry, because when Windows 10 was first out in beta, they basically told everybody, hey, we're tracking everything you do, everything you type, blah, blah, blah. And this is just to make Windows 10 better. Now, there's some honesty to that. And they said that you can opt out. So that should have never been a default, but regardless, you can opt out of it. But then even if you can opt out of it, point being is they don't always have to tell you, and they can do that. So if you're using Windows anyway, I mean, you're kind of screwed as is, as far as like Microsoft getting an ass ton of data about you. Okay. But regardless, from a, security standpoint on its own, security in the abstract, yeah, there's an argument to end up using Edge. But again, my initial point here is that Microsoft is playing a little dirty with these stupid little advertisements. And that's basically what they are advertisements, telling you, hey, maybe you want to consider using Edge. Again, if you're using anything other than Chrome, there's no way. You're not interested in that at all. And it's just stupid. But now what's happened is Google has, I could argue that they've kind of shot back. I don't know if I'd exactly use those terms, but basically, so ever since Credge became a thing, and I really want people to get used to, to calling it that. I could get into an argument or not an argument, a conversation around Chromium based Edge. I mean, and it's not even that, we want an open web. And so you want more open standards you want a lot of standards is the point. Not that you necessarily, because Chromium is technically an open standard. But you don't want a monoculture, right? Not even getting into that, but there was some real brilliance being done with Edge HTML, with that web rendering engine. And also, there's still a lot of the security aspects, because Edge, granted, it wasn't exactly a hot target, but Edge was winning a lot of security competitions or was doing very well, getting second place, say, whatever. And that's great. And to not have that anymore, that's kind of disappointing. Because I felt like they really cleaned up. It is different from the Trident engine that Internet Explorer was using, but there's some really crisp shit about it. And I'll admit I kind of miss that, even though, I tell people all the time, don't even use Windows, fucking, use Linux. But regardless of that was the thing. So, but I don't want to go there. So Credge now, what you can do is you can go to the Chrome web store, right? And because it's Chromium based, you can actually install the way Microsoft has it set up, because this is not true for all Chromium based web browsers, right? Like with Opera, which also uses the Blink engine or Chromium. Blink is like a fork of WebKit, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, even though Opera uses Blink, just like Chrome does, you have to install a specific extension to be able to install Chrome extensions. So you have to put on an Opera extension to be able to use Chrome extensions. With Credge, you can more or less just install Chrome extensions out of the box. And this solves, of course, a major problem that Edge was having because, there weren't a lot of, Microsoft was being very selective in what add-ons and extensions that they would allow for onto Edge. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because they were making sure that those extensions were on the up and up. How many times do we hear a year or even a month about, this Chrome extension was, tracking, user data or was leaking user data or was doing whatever, that happens all the time. And so for Edge to be a little more particular or a lot more particular, I think is a fine and dandy thing. Less really can be more as long as it's the right stuff. And really, if you have uBlock Origin and LastPass, what the fuck else do you need? And Edge had both. Regardless, so you can install, any Chrome extension onto Credge. But now, and this just started like last week, now when you do that, a little reminder from Google will pop up saying that, like at the top, when you're looking at the Chrome Web Store, and it'll say Google recommends switching to Chrome to use extensions securely. And then it gives you a link, download Google Chrome. So Google's kind of pulling the same bullshit that Microsoft was saying, hey, I know you're using Firefox, but maybe you want to try Edge. When again, it's like, no, I'm being very particular here. That's what I want to use. Now, certainly I think that there are people who, you have tyranny of the default, right? Which, kind of under a software minimalism, with that in mind, with that angle, the tyranny of the default sometimes can actually be an okay thing. But regardless, there could be people who just, they power up their new Windows 10 laptop. Hell, maybe it's one that's still in S mode that you can still buy those. And, and you'll just end up using Edge, right? Or Credge in this case. And then, I could use Google Chrome. I kind of feel like if you're going to the Chrome Web Store from within Credge, that you really do know what you're doing. And so it's still kind of bullshit, but it's not as bad, not necessarily as bad as what Microsoft is doing. But this is a little nasty for Chrome. And, there might be a little bit of truth to this. There might be truth to the idea that, maybe this, because of the compatibility layer that basically Microsoft would have to implement into Credge to use, Chrome extensions, Chrome Web Store extensions specifically, that, maybe there's a security concern there. Maybe there's something that happens within that where, this is kind of a third party situation. This might not be best for you. There might be a little bit of truth to that, but I don't know that there's truth to that. But what I really see here is Google sweating. If this wasn't happening enough, if there weren't user numbers, as in users of Credge going to the Chrome Web Store, if there wasn't a large enough amount of people, if the stats weren't there, that this was something that they even had to bother to mention, then I don't think they'd mention it. I don't think they'd even bring that pop-up up if there wasn't a shit ton of people actually using Credge, and going to the Chrome Web Store. So I think Google's sweating this a little bit. And I think people are tired of Chrome being such a bloated, fucking piece of kit. Because, and it is. Chrome works great, on a Chromebook, but on just about everything else, holy hell. What a mess. Not to say that, most web browsers, frankly, are a mess. I actually, Safari might be because it runs so clean, within macOS. That might be the best of the bunch. But, man. So this is my point. I say all of this to suggest that I don't think that the browser wars are over. I don't think you have to just cave in and say, well, fuck, I'll use Chrome. I think that Google is seeing, people are wanting to get away from this. They're wanting to try something new. And there's something to that also it's just something new. And so people might want to try it. And hell, maybe in a matter of days, months, maybe even years, they'll say, yeah, I want to go back over to Chrome. But I would argue that right now is really the time to do one of two things. because I think that this suggests that the browser wars aren't over. I recommend one of two things. You pick one, or do both. Hell, you could really do both. Okay. One is that do not rely upon a browser as a platform to hold, all of your varying info, and you become reliant upon certain extensions, or you become reliant upon the way that, like, the history within a specific browser, whatever. Okay. Granted, most browsers can transfer your password history and bookmarks and whatever else from one to the other. But I think in the future, this is not going to be as easy, as in Google is going to do whatever they can to lock you into Chrome. And let's be clear here. There's some agnosticism that could be had with operating systems today. That's not as important. But your web browser is in many ways really, for most people, it's their operating system. It's how they engage, the internet, and it's how they engage their computer. Like the web browser for most people is just always open. I try to do things to where my web browser is closed as much as possible, right? But that's a very specific mindset, and you really need to be intentional about that. But either make it so that your online use and data, etc., is not reliant upon, in your workflow, is not reliant upon a specific web browser. Which, if you're storing like everything in LastPass is everywhere. And so, you don't necessarily have to worry about that, right? That's one way of doing that. I know they used to. LastPass I forget what it was called, but they had an extension, an add-on. It wasn't Crossover. It was like X bookmarks or something like that, where it actually was basically like LastPass, but for bookmarks. And that never really worked out too well. And I don't even think they really offer it anymore. Maybe they just, again, maybe that's a symptom of what I'm talking about, where I am worried that, and even Firefox, frankly, where a lot of these, the major browsers are going to do and are doing everything they can to lock you into that browser to where you only want to use that browser. So you can either set it up so that you don't, whatever you do, you're safe not getting locked into a browser, or pick the browser that basically right now that you want to use for the rest of your life. Those are the two options. Again, you could kind of do both, but those are really and I would almost argue to do both, but those are really the two options you're left with right now. Are you going to ask me right now in 2020, because maybe I haven't said this in 2020, what web browser do I recommend that you use? The Tor browser, of course. Actually, that's not a bad idea, but there's a lot of parts of the internet you're not going to be able to use if you do. Even though, again, as we talked about, I want to say we talked about this in early 2019, or maybe it's late 2018, that the Tor project overall is trying to become, and its Tor browser that it develops is trying to become something that is far more mainstream and isn't all about using the dark web, right? So, certainly that's an option there. But as far as like from the mainstream, I guess, well, if you're using KDE, of course, use Conqueror, right? But if you're talking about, like between Vivaldi, Brave, Opera, Edge, because Edge is available not just on Windows anymore, or, Firefox or Chrome, if you're talking about like those kind of big boys. Okay. Among that grouping, I would say use Firefox. That's still my top recommendation. In fact, actually on Android, and I got a brief glimpse at this, but later this year, there's supposed to be an even faster and sleeker, as it were, version of Firefox that's supposed to get released for Android. And I'm interested to see that. Of course, Firefox was significantly sped up by Mozilla in the past. Well, what was that, in 2017, I think, when that happened, where they came out with the Quantum web engine, which basically replaced Gecko. So yeah, I would stick with Firefox. And so if you are in the mindset of, okay, I'm going to change away right now, clearly Google's sweating because people are leaving it and you want to be one of those people and hey, rock and roll, I would recommend Firefox. And like I said earlier, if you want to set your search engine for something, because that's certainly an important thing, I do recommend DuckDuckGo as far as that goes. So anyway, that I did not expect that conversation to go that long. But so, well, let's get into our main story for this week. We're going to see what all we're going to be able to get into in this episode. But I think that's an important conversation to have at least once a year. Because like I said, web browsers are like, that is really the software du jour, right? I mean, that is the most important space, with computers and even, mobile devices right now, that, yeah, it's important to update that and to keep talking about it at least once a year to get into it, because I mean, that's a bigger deal for most people than operating systems. Okay. And I mean, the mobile part is important, but a funny thing, in fact, I don't think I got to bring this point up. I know I talked about it on Twitter, and of course you can follow me there at Sovryn Tech. I didn't talk about it on Telegram. And boy, if you want to have a good time, you got to join the Sovryn Tech Telegram group. Link is in the show notes for that. The conversations in there, the brilliance of Sovryn Tech listeners is on full display. And I'm so fucking honored by that. You got to check it out. Do so. Anyway, but I know I mentioned it on Twitter, and this is when Apple announced their latest iPads. One of the big deals that they were talking about is that they brought on the full desktop version of Safari. Now, like I said, I like Safari fine. I have no problem with that web browser. I'm a big supporter. If you're a Mac user, I mean, okay. All right. Let me caveat. I'm glad I brought this up. And I've said this many times, but we got to say it. If you are a Mac user, maybe I don't recommend using Firefox there. And if you're a Mac user, I think Safari is absolutely the way to go. I really do. I think the team behind Safari does great work. Now, this is important because when the new iPads came out, of course, I mean, and even I talked about it, I think at the time, it was really exciting that you can now attach external hard drives to an iPad, or maybe specifically the iPad Pro, but all the same, I'm sure it'll trickle down. And that's really cool. But the other part that Apple made a huge deal about was that you were getting desktop class Safari, desktop class web browsing on an iPad. Now you might hear that and say, yeah, well, that's interesting marketing. Okay. Oh, that's great. Whatever. The funny part about that is that is being sold as a feature that makes it a superior experience. That's basically saying to you that mobile web browsers suck. And I don't think Apple's wrong. I think that's completely honest marketing for a rare time, even in Apple's history. Mobile browsing does suck ass, and frankly, as far as smartphone browsers go, if you don't do web browsing at all on your smartphone, I argue you're doing it right. Save that shit for your laptop or desktop or whatever. Okay. Or your iPad, which is basically a laptop now, which fine. Great. But I thought that was so goddamn funny that they were making such a big deal of and they were even using the verbiage, use the web the way it was meant to be and blah, 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 or use the web the way it was meant to be. Yeah, absolutely. You should web browsing on a smartphone is bullshit. And I love that Apple was frankly honest about that. And so, yeah, choosing a web browser, and don't be so worried about whether or not it works well on mobile. But again, it's nice as far as my recommendation of Firefox that you're going to get a faster version of it. If you're using Android, again, if you're using iOS, if you're already in iOS, stick within the system and you're probably going to end up using Safari anyway, right? Stick within Apple's ecosystem because you're already so knee deep in that. That's not to say that everything Apple does is great. We've talked about that recently, concerns around iCloud. That was just a couple episodes of Sovryn Tech ago, but regardless, there you go. Anyway, let's get into, we'll see what stories we can get into here. But before we get into them, I got to tell you about Sovryn Tech sponsor. In fact, I am honored to say, I found out about this in the Telegram group. I am honored to say that this sponsor has once again bumped up in the numbers. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So we are talking about none other than Free Talk Live. The website is freetalklive.com. This is radio that you control because it's an open phones show that you can call in. And believe me, you can call in. You really can talk about whatever the fuck you want to talk about. More or less. I mean, and I was a host at one point. I mean, there's practically almost no screening whatsoever. So you can get in there and you can talk about whatever. It really is a great time. Now, freetalklive.com or Free Talk Live, understand, you can go to that website and this is a show that runs 7 nights a week, 3 hours a night, 365 days a year. And it's been going for well over a decade, and you get to go and listen to all of that. Now you're saying, well, it's an open phone show. That's great. Yeah, but how do I know my voice is going to get heard? Let me tell you how you're going to know. And this is the thing. Throughout 2019, so they were a sponsor throughout 2019. They have re-upped as a sponsor in 2020, and I'm honored by that. But throughout 2019, I was telling you they're the number 27 talk show in the United States. Well, guess what? Now they are number 26. And I think that is absolutely something worth mentioning and talking about. And I mean, that's so exciting. Granted, you know, it's been a few years since I was a host on that show. When I was a host, I think they were like in the 40s. They just keep going up every year. Why? Because they're there. They keep putting out great content. It's such an engaging show. That's why they keep going up the list like that. Number 26 talk show in the United States, and the only libertarian show on the radio, by the way. Again, you can also grab it as a podcast from the website, but I am so honored as always to have them as a sponsor, and I am honored by their success, and I congratulate Free Talk Live on going up to number 26. That is no small feat. Believe me, I wish Sovryn Tech was the number 26 talk show in the United States. I'd be pleased as punch, baby. So check it out, freetalklive.com, and I thank them for sponsoring Sovryn Tech. Now, you know, let's get into, again, I'm not sure how much time we're going to have here to get into another subject, but let's get into another subject here. You know, in the Foreplay, I was going to talk about Firefox is also released in beta for, I think it's available on most platforms. It might even be available on iOS, but I'm not going to get into it right now. I know it's available on Windows and certainly Android. But they're going full on with their VPN service. Mozilla is, and they're using, again, it's still in beta, but it's an open beta and you basically sign up like through the Play Store or whatever. It has, I think it's $5 a month for it if you get in on the beta, but they're calling it Firefox VPN, and it uses WireGuard, which is a different protocol than OpenVPN, one that I'm very interested in and have been deep diving in for a little while now. They are going through Mullvad, which is the VPN service that I was looking into mostly with WireGuard. This is going to be interesting. Going to keep an eye on it. And we're going to talk about it more in the future, but it is out there. I'm just putting it on your radar. We don't need to have a huge conversation around it, but there are advantages to WireGuard, but there are also, you know, companies that I do trust, Private Internet Access or AirVPN, which are the top two that I've recommended for years. They are holding off on implementing WireGuard. Again, that's a conversation, more technical one that we'll get into in a future episode around that, but just making you aware, if you want to try out the WireGuard VPN, Firefox VPN is a great way to go as far as having, because you could use, I mean, normally I would just recommend go through Mullvad itself if you want to try that out. But Firefox VPN is also available on mobile, and using a VPN on mobile, I consider essential, if not even more important. Well, no, you should use it the same. It's not more important than using it on desktop. You should use a VPN at all times, everywhere. Okay. That's the bottom line. I have a VPN running 24/7 on my smartphone. I mean, Ellen Sovryn has a VPN running on her smartphone 24/7. Do you not? Yeah, there you go. So, I mean, this is what you do. Okay. This is how it's done. So, but this is a great option for you to run with as far as that goes, or if you want to check it out again, it is in beta. So, you know, be a little careful with it, I guess, but regardless, check it out. Okay. So we're going to go, I mean, basically been talking tech here for a bit. We're going to go way out into left field. Right? We're going to get into some science, of course, because Sovryn Tech has always been a show about science and technology and how they can help set you free, or maybe how you need to set yourself free from technology. And well, anyway, but this is interesting and plays a bit off of what we were talking about last week. And I had some other stories lined up, had to do with Warren Buffett, which, well, anyway, concerns around growth and the tech sector. I think that there is a great conversation to have around that. I don't know if we're going to get into that here. I did get in the Telegram, in the Sovereign Tech Telegram group, there was a recommendation to talk about tech and pandemics. And I think that is something that we are definitely going to get into probably in the next episode of Sovereign Tech. But that is a deep dive that could go for a conversation that could easily go an hour on its own. Okay, but we will get into that. But let's at least get into this because I've had this saved for a little while. Its original posting is from January 14th, 2020. And we are going to go into one of my favorite places, and that is outer space. Woo! This is directly to understand, because when I read the headline to you, you might say, oh, well, holy shit, that's nuts. But I think where this is coming from gives it all the validity that it needs, because this is coming directly from nasa.gov. Okay. And so here we go. This is the headline. Could future homes on the moon and Mars be made of fungi or fungi, right? Anyway, I could tell a story about my dad there with the terms fungi and fungi. He would have a lot of, well, my dad was a fun guy and he'd have a lot of fun with that. You know where that joke's going to go, but regardless, let's read a little bit of the story here and then let's talk about it. And this is going to play into our conversation, our main conversation that we had last week about the possibility that, like I said, and I know as crazy as it sounds, but listen to the episode if you hadn't yet, from last week, where we talked about the idea that the internet might be a sapient living organism at this stage. So let's talk about, or let's read it here from, again, this is directly from NASA. Granted, I mean, it's a blog, but still NASA's giving it the time of day. Science fiction often imagines our future on Mars and other planets as run by machines, with metallic cities and flying cars rising above dunes of red sand. But the reality may be even stranger and greener. Instead of habitats made of metal and glass, NASA is exploring technologies that could grow structures out of fungi to become our future homes in the stars, and perhaps lead to more sustainable ways of living on Earth as well. The MISO Architecture Project, MISO is in mycelium, out of NASA's Ames Research Center. So again, this is something being developed by NASA itself. This is not a joke. This is not fancifulness. This is the real deal. In California's Silicon Valley is prototyping technologies that could grow habitats on the moon, Mars, and beyond out of life, specifically fungi and the unseen underground threads that make up the main part of the fungus known as mycelia. Well, I guess it'd be myco, right? Like mycologist. Anyway, regardless, but made out of mycelia. Now there's a conversation to have here, but let's keep reading. Quote, right now, traditional habitat designs for Mars are like a turtle, carrying our homes with us on our backs. A reliable plan, but with huge energy costs, end quote, said Lynn Rothschild. Rothschild. Reading on. The principal investigator on the early stage project. Quote, instead, we could harness mycelia to grow these habitats ourselves when we get there, end quote. Ultimately, the project envisions a future where human explorers can bring a compact habitat built out of a lightweight material with dormant fungi that will last on long journeys to places like Mars. Upon arrival, by unfolding that basic structure and simply adding water, the fungi will be able to grow around that framework into a fully functional human habitat, all while being safely contained within the habitat to avoid contaminating the Martian environment. Now, okay, there's more here, and we can read a little bit more, but I want to talk a little bit about this. So the idea of there just being this basic structure, okay? Now, this is the nature of most designs for habitats, either on the moon or Mars, really for the past 50 years. Like, this has been the idea. Either you would end up, like having a balloon or some kind of ballooning plastic, whatever, that would be around an infrastructure, like basic, arches and things like this, that maybe would be made out of metal or something, or maybe a plastic of a type, something along those lines. That part isn't exactly new, but using mycelia or fungi, to actually make the habitat, more of the structure itself instead of the infrastructure, That's a fairly new concept that I hadn't heard, but this isn't the first time that, and we covered this on Sovryn Tech, quite a few years ago, where on Mars, they were talking about actually using ice as, instead of fungi, but, you'd have an infrastructure and then they would basically make it an ice castle around this infrastructure. And it was a brilliant idea. Particularly in the way that it would handle temperature. Now, I wonder, and maybe this is part of why they're not just going to run, balls out with this, with using fungi for the, for the outer structure. Okay. Maybe there are temperature concerns to be had with that. But overall, I think that this is a brilliant idea. Now, I'm kind of wondering about this idea that, well, we don't want to, bother the Martian habitat, but then fucking using, fungus, like, and that stuff just goes everywhere. I mean, just tap a mushroom and it goes down, right? I mean, the stuff's everywhere, right? So that's a little weird, even though I like the idea that they are concerned about the natural, indigenous ecology, of a plant, of whatever planetoid. Maybe they don't mention the moon so much with this, but anyway, but with Mars, that is interesting. I'm glad that they're at least thinking that, and we're not simply going up there, okay, let's just put a bunch of human shit down and, we'll just terraform this whole goddamn thing and, and make it habitable for humans instead of making it, well, for what it was either going to evolve to or so on. There's more to talk about with this, but why don't I read a little bit about it? In fact, here's the fungus among us. That's the subheader. A fungus is a group of organisms that produces spores and eats up organic material like the yeast in bread or beer, the mushroom in your salad, the mold that may grow if you let that salad sit in the refrigerator for too long, or even the organisms that produce antibiotics like penicillin. But the part of a fungus you probably haven't seen is mycelia. These tiny threads build complex structures with extreme precision, networking out into larger structures like mushrooms. With the right conditions, they can be coaxed into making new structures, ranging from a material similar to leather to the building blocks for a Mars habitat, living on the moon and Mars. Creating a livable home for future astronauts means doing more than growing a roof to go over their heads. Astronauts will need to have their basic needs met, just like on Earth, and face the additional challenges of living in a harsh environment on a distant world. The Myco Architecture project can't just design a shell. It's designing a home. The home is more than a set of walls. It has its own ecosystem of sorts, with multiple kinds of organisms alongside the humans it's designed to protect. Just like the astronauts, fungal mycelia is a life form that has to eat and breathe. That's where something called cyanobacteria comes in, a kind of bacteria that can use energy from the sun to convert water and carbon dioxide into oxygen and fungus food. These pieces come together in an elegant habitat concept with a 3-layered dome. And there is a full video, folks, Stanley breaking in. There is a full video here where you can see the basic idea of what this looks like. And it is actually, in my opinion, it's stunning. Like, I think it's actually a beautiful design. And it's not just because it looks so, no pun intended, alien in comparison to the bulk of what we build on Earth. But that brings up a point, and that is, I wouldn't mind if they wanted to make homes out of this on this planet. I'd be totally okay with that. But regardless, let's see, that water serves as a protection from radiation and trickles down to the second layer, the cyanobacteria. This layer can take that water and photosynthesize using the outside light that shines through the icy layer to produce oxygen for astronauts and nutrients for the final layer of mycelia. That last layer of mycelia is what organically grows into a sturdy home. First activated to grow in a contained environment and then baked to kill the life forms, providing structural integrity and ensuring no life contaminates Mars and any microbial life that's already there. Stanley breaking in, again, that, in my opinion, is going to be a real challenge. And as far as killing the life forms, well, that's where we need to have a little bit of a longer conversation, and we'll get into that in a second. Even if some mycelia somehow escaped, they will be genetically altered to be incapable of surviving outside of the habitat. Right. Kind of like GMO tomatoes, yet they end up killing off the heirloom tomatoes. But anyway, that's kind of where some of my debate comes from in this. But not to say, look, this is a brilliant idea. The idea of where all of this really is its own ecosystem, and they're doing everything they can to where, it generates oxygen and so much more. I mean, this is brilliant shit. But let me read on a little bit more. Bringing synthetic biology back to Earth. But this is just the start. Mycelia could be used for water filtration and biomining systems that can extract minerals from wastewater. Another project active in Rothschild's lab, as well as bioluminescent lighting. Woo, there we go. Humidity regulation and even self-generating habitats capable of healing themselves. And with about 40% of carbon emissions on Earth coming from construction, there's an ever-increasing need for sustainable and affordable housing here as well. Quote, when we design for space, we're free to experiment with new ideas and materials with much more freedom than would be on Earth, said Rothschild. And after these prototypes are designed to other worlds, we can bring them back to ours. The harsh environments of the moon and Mars will require new ways of living, growing homes instead of building them. Mining minerals from sewage instead of rock. But by turning to the elegant systems of our own natural world, we can design solutions that are green and sustainable. Whether on distant worlds or on our ever-changing Earth, fungi could be what brings us boldly into the future. Look, obviously, I love this idea. And I don't just love it, like I said, on the moon and on Mars. I love it right here on Earth. I mean, the idea of, and this is something, even in 2019, it was a subject that we revisited. I want to say it was maybe even in December of 2019. The idea of, well, in that sense, we were talking about growing machines, like biological machines or biological. And this is something that I talked about years ago. So it's a subject we've kind of come back to over and over again. In fact, it most recently came up because there was this idea of biological Internet of Things, biological IoT. Now, IoT in itself as an abstract concept is a horrible idea. There's no good way to do it. But the notion that you could grow IoT devices played into what I had said previously, and we'll kind of, dig deeper into this here, I think is, a brilliant idea. But there's a way that you have to go about it. And this plays into, again, the idea of what do we do if, say, we suddenly find out that the internet has become a living, sentient, maybe even sapient organism. So again, having, lights grown into these houses and all this stuff. You don't build anymore. You don't have this production facility anymore and all this stuff just grows. Now, granted, I can already hear people screaming, what about the economy? Yeah, what the fuck about it? Moving on. Think about that. Think about how, okay, so because I know there are people listening to this and I don't mean to insult you. I know there are people listening to this where you instantly thought about that, but I want you to think about, okay, wait, so we can grow homes that might cost practically nothing, if anything at all. And, we can have bioluminescent. What if the walls themselves could basically light up? You don't even have to have a light fixture anymore. Okay. Light bulbs aren't going to get made anymore, blah, blah, blah. Just take these things, to where you could even grow the furniture while you're at it. Everything is designed and you basically just water and it's like a chia pet and it just, boom, there it is. That's amazing, right? Doesn't that sound great? I don't know. I love the idea that I could cheaply design my own home, have everything that I want in it. It might even be easy to renovate at some point by just, adding some more fungi here and then, adding water and boom, there's a brand new table for you. All this being done incredibly inexpensively and amazing, right? And all being very, good for the environment and you're getting rid of so much production process. And it would probably allow for, imagine if homeless people could just instantly, grow effectively, like it'd be the mushroom version of a bivvy, right? Of a bivvy sack. And you could just instantly have an illuminated, warm home for homeless people just about anywhere. And yet you probably, so many people probably thought, well, what about the jobs? What about, how are there's going to be whole sectors that are going to fall apart once this becomes a thing and blah, blah, blah. And again, think about this. You are basically telling people they can't own their own home because if they grew their home from mushrooms and it was so inexpensive so people are going to lose jobs. So, what's more important? People having a roof over their head or parts of the economy, making sure that there's plenty of money. Do you see the problem here? This is a rampant solution for so many issues on planet Earth. Homeless people go down the fucking list. And yeah, I mean, and you're saying, well, yeah, but then if people don't have jobs and blah, 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 then, we're going to have a whole lot more homeless people. And it's going to be this weird cycle where, okay, maybe they'll have a mushroom shelter over their heads, but they're not going to end up having a job. No. Let's think about taking care of, people. I mean, I'm an egoist. Okay. So, don't confuse what I'm saying here. I'm just saying you're worried about jobs, but then, we have so many people who don't have a roof over their head and so on. And just consider where your mind went and think about, wait, where is really the problem, right? Is the problem, cheap homes made out of mushrooms, or is the problem, or out of fungi, or is the problem like this concern that, oh shit, if there's this disruptive technology, a whole lot of people are going to lose their jobs. I don't want to get lost on that whole subject, but I'm just bringing it up. Okay. Like, where is your head at when we think about these things? Moving on. I mean, maybe the reason that this idea didn't even come up previously and why it's not getting implemented on Earth in the first place is partly because you have people who are thinking not so much about happiness and health, but they're thinking about money more so. And no, I hate to break it to you, but happiness and health ultimately has, or at the very least should have, very little to do with money. But that is a completely different abstract conversation to get into. Okay. And if you have questions about that, please feel free to ask. Okay. You don't have to stop listening to the show. How about engage the show on that subject? Now, that's not to say that there's, a world without money or anything like that. Nobody's saying that. I'm just saying, let's keep things in perspective and let's prioritize perhaps properly what it means to be human in comparison of what it means for, the economy of a certain sector of, civilization or a certain part of civilization. Let's answer, or let's ask those questions. And yes, let us come with answers. Regardless, back to outer space and back to this concept of homes made out of fungus. So one of the rare people that I have given a lot of time to on the show is a man named Dr. Paul Stamets. Okay. And Dr. Paul Stamets wrote a book called Mycelium Running. Now, this book is kind of notorious today. I think it's a brilliant book. And actually, Dr. Stamets has talked about other things where I have played entire TED Talks by him on Sovryn Tech because I thought that they were so brilliant and so important. One of those is an episode, I think it's episode 190. I know I shared it in the Telegram group because there are other podcasts that are kind of going down this train of thought that I think is worthwhile, but where, we're talking about the idea that basically you could use mycelia because they are these fibers, interconnected throughout the entire planet, frankly. Of course, when you watch Star Trek Discovery, which the idea of the mycelial drive came from Dr. Paul Stamets. And that's why actually the mycologist, or the, whatever they call him, mycological engineer or whatever, Stamets is on that. That's why his name is Paul Stamets, because it's based off of the real guy. Okay. Now the mycelial engine is probably pure nonsense, and I just say probably, but we're not here to talk about that. Okay. We're not going to get into Star Trek Discovery because I can't think of worse things to talk about or much worse things to talk about, except for maybe Game of Thrones. I certainly put them on the same level of horribleness. Regardless, so I've played a lot of content from this guy, and we've had the conversation around the idea that you could use, like in Star Trek Discovery, what they call like the mycelial network, but what on Earth is a very real thing where mycelia is all interconnected. And Dr. Stamets talks about this in his book, Mycelium Running, and also in varying TED Talks that he's given, real TED Talks, so it's not TEDx. And the idea of using that as an internet, right? But then we run into the same problem. And this is also true for using mycelia or, using fungi for homes. Okay. We run into the same issue here. Just like we were asking the question last week, if the internet is a living thing, what are its, for lack of a better term, because I don't like the word rights, but for lack of a better term, what are its rights? Should we leave it alone? Or are we feeding it just by our usage of it? Are our web browsers, basically, are they part of its nervous system, its nerve endings? These are very, very big questions to get into, but that's not saying that, yes, the internet is a living thing, but what if it is? And then also, like, if that is, say, or more importantly, if mycelia, and this is an abstract concept that, in fact, somebody was asking about this in the Sovereign Tech Telegram group, they were asking me, would I put mycelia in the same category of sapient species as I do humans, dolphins, elephants, and some others, octopi or octopuses. Sorry, octopi is not the right term. And perhaps a couple other species out there. Would I put them in there if we find out that they are somehow like this larger living organism, even though it's all interconnected, man? And I said, potentially, because partly I haven't given it enough. I've given it thought of using it as like a biological internet, right? But when I was saying that years ago, talking about using mycelia or the mycelia network on Earth as, instead of laying out fiber, we just connect devices, okay, through, and I know this is far out, but let's talk about it. Using the mycelia, the network of mycelia on Earth as our internet, as our way of interconnecting our devices. Okay. And this is not new. I talked about this. There was an episode of 2099 where I predicted this kind of thing, where I had a lot of fun with it. That was a fictional episode, but I've talked about this for some time. Okay. And now I just talked about if we could do that. And it seems, and certainly Dr. Stamets seemed to be laying it out that, maybe we could. But then if you find out that it's a living organism, but it's sentient and sapient, as in knowledgeable and conscious, in a different way than we understand as human beings, but still perhaps worthy of rights because, it acts with agency, acts outside of instinct, and so on, which is, my gauge for whether or not something is sapient as compared to just sentient, like, an animal that only operates on instincts. If we find that out, what do we do at that point? Right. And that was what I was also saying about the internet, the mechanical, the hardline, Ethernet everywhere, that infrastructure, internet that we engage today. Okay. And so like last week I was asking, well, what do we do if we find that out? Just like, what do we do if we find out mycelia is? Well, is it okay to use mycelia, fungi, to use that to build homes and then kill it? To keep it from infecting the rest of Mars and all this. These are big questions, but they're potentially very real ones, because I think what NASA's laying out here is, at the end of the day, regardless of ethics, is a brilliant idea. Okay. Probably could work overall. And I think actually has far more interesting prospects for, being used on Earth and well, that solves other issues, like maybe we don't have to kill it if we're building it on the planet that it originated from in the first place. Of course, granted, it is genetically modified or genetically altered. That gets into certain questions, and where those arguments go, because they're being had right now over the food that you eat, that you buy at the grocery store, right, with GMOs and so on. And that's a bigger conversation than we're really going to have here, or that is a different, bigger conversation than what we're going to have here, because certainly this conversation is big in itself. But if we find out that mycelia is actually conscious and that it's sapient, or we find out that the internet is now sapient, the real answer, I think, is that you find a way to basically because like I said, there's a chance that you find out that, well, the way that we use the internet is part of its version, that collection of data is its version of photosynthesis. Now, that doesn't mean that the NSA collecting all of it is okay and using it against you. Okay. That's just arguing that this is how this thing lives. Okay. Now you do run into the problem of, what if humans one day decide that, the internet is driving us fucking insane, and so we're not going to use it anymore. Does that end up killing it? Right? That'd be like, blocking out the sun to kill off all the plant life. Well, again, when we get to that stage, those are the conversations that we're going to have. And I asked the questions here first on Sovereign Tech. Thank you very much. But regardless, there is, and I always talk about on Sovereign Tech what we call the science fiction method, right? Which is the idea, kind of like the scientific method, but the science fiction method, which, we purport on Sovereign Tech. Asimov, I think, was really the first one to come up with it, but no one else has really taken it, I think, to its logical conclusion, is that science fiction isn't just a genre of literature or entertainment or whatever. Science fiction is actually a method of grasping the rapid, especially technological, but certainly other cultural and other ways. But it is a way of grasping the rapid change that humanity has been going through. I would argue that it's ironic that the rise of science fiction coincides with many other cultural civilizational changes. For example, science fiction becomes, there's science fiction work before the industrial age, but science fiction really comes into fore, once the industrial age starts. And when you get into the atomic age, and when you get, and you get into the internet age, I mean, it just keeps, as there's these more technological complexities or cultural complexities get entered in to, the human condition. Not to say that they're a part of the human condition, but it's what the human condition is engaging. Science fiction grows at the same rate if you're looking at a chart, right? And I think that's because it's almost an unconscious response. Writing science fiction is almost an unconscious response to, there can be other reasons for it that people write it and whatever else, of course, but it's an unconscious response to the rapid change that humanity is going through. So we use often, or I like to use science fiction as a way of, again, it's not necessarily proof of what something is going to become or do, but it is a way of trying to understand it. Okay. And in this case, I will pay fealty to what is really my favorite television show ever. And I don't know how many times I've used this, except for when we've gotten into the conversation of organic or biological machines, computers, etc. But that is Babylon 5. I don't use it often, even though I could easily just quote it basically every episode. We often run to Star Trek because, most people have a common frame of reference for that. We've already mentioned it once with Discovery. But in Babylon 5, you have this very advanced species known as the Vorlons. And the Vorlons are of particular interest to the younger races in the universe or in the galaxy, partly because, they're a mystery, but also it's known that they have biological, they have biotech, they have biological, conscious machines. And in fact, their ships that they, pilot or that they arrive in and that they use in their fleets, etc., are creatures themselves. They are sapient creatures themselves. In fact, there's an episode where someone has to they have to hide in a Vorlon ship on the station. And the ship actually sings to him, sings him to sleep. And, so it's clearly an intelligent creature in itself, right? And I think the only ethical way to engage, say, if we find out that mycelia is a conscious, sapient organism, or that the internet, even though it is, it's technological, right? It's not organic, or, there's parts of it now that are, but, as far as tech that gets used for it, right? If you want to count OLED screens on, again, organic's a funny term. But regardless, even though it is, more machine, right? Even then, a machine can be sapient. Or I think that there is a time where that is going to be a thing, even though we don't think that that's there yet. But I'm open to that possibility, which is why we had the conversation we did last week. But we'll have to find a way to where, we basically coexist and we have an understanding. And there is a mutual, there's a beneficial way of engaging the universe and life with these other sapient species. This is the same thing, just like with dolphins. Well, how do we handle the fact that and I consider it a fact, that they are sapient? Well, we don't eat them. We don't kill them, It's pretty simple. And maybe, we shouldn't, pollute the fuck out of out of their home, right? Out of their habitats. Of course, we shouldn't do that to ourselves either, but regardless, Yeah, I think that's kind of the answer. Now, what does that end up looking like? That's a great question. But I am open to, and because we've talked about it previously, the idea that mycelia is a different, it could very well, that whole network throughout the entire planet could very well be a life form itself. And I mean, it is a life form. There's no question that it's life, but it could be a life form itself. It could be a sapient life form, which is where we get into the idea that we don't kill it, but we find a way to, interact with it, to coexist with it. I know this is really big stuff. I mean, does that mean you don't step on mushrooms anymore? Does that mean this? That's as we explore what life is like for this thing, or, for potentially this thing, this mycelia, all around the planet. Or also, again, how do we engage if you find out that the internet is also a sapient living organism? Okay. That just operates under, and I don't know if I've talked about this on a Sovryn Tech episode recently, or if it was on a recent Zomi One Underground Q&A. But this is, so to get into it quickly, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but the reason I have a problem with the word rights is that rights, you can think, if you think they're God-given, well, then you think they're an essential part of creation. I don't know how God gave you the right exactly to having a gun, but to me, it's just property. But then even property rights are based upon the respect principle, right? That's getting into a huge conversation in itself. Regardless, rights are basically social constructs. They're not you can't measure a right. A right is not a scientific thing. It is a subjective thing. It is not objective. It's not. Now, there are biological factors, functions, or what some people call a biological universal that you have, like empathy and others, okay, where now those you can extrapolate what is a healthy expression of being a certain type of life form. Like being empathetic is a healthy expression of being a certain type of human. We could get into arguments about Homo sapiens and are there different types of species Homo that we don't really recognize. That's certainly conversations we've had on Sovryn Tech, over time. My point being is that a creature being sapient is not exclusive to the bipeds that we understand on planet Earth, right? Sapience can come from an organism that operates in a more, say, less individualistic way. There's no requirement that only sapience is possible. And I know the term comes from Homo sapiens, but that's just the Latin word for knowledgeable. Okay. So, because Homo sapien just means knowing man. That's all that means. So there's no reason that knowing has to be exclusive to Homo sapiens. Again, it's just a Latin word. So sapience, the issue is that the natural functions and the natural healthy functions of, say, mycelia, or hell, of dolphins or elephants, or the internet as we know it, if it were a singular organism, even if it's not a singular organism, but that would be to seem, the evidence that gets presented would suggest that. Those are different rules, as it were, different functions than how humans operate. And so you can't put human morality on them, certainly, because again, that's a social construct, but you can't even put, human healthy biological universals or functions of which you could actually extrapolate something like ethics from onto these same life forms. So we have to have an understanding of how they function to really even begin to answer the question of how do we interact with them? How do we engage with them? What is the ethical way to engage with them? What is the ethical way to treat them? And so on. And we don't know until we even begin to consider that and people are beginning to consider it. Again, we have the work of Dr. Stamets, which is getting into it. I talked about the book Web Awake, which was, really where this, as far as I can tell, more or less, this idea that the internet was actually becoming a living organism, was from. And so the conversation has started. There are people thinking about it and working on it, but we have to continue this conversation. We have to have these conversations, I would argue, before it's too late. So that, I mean, because wouldn't that be amazing if, hell yeah, mycelia would love to be turned into homes and for humans to have, inhabit them. And there is some kind of great relationship that is had between the two or something. I mean, what a beautiful future that would be. But I mean, most people aren't even willing to consider that there are other sapient life forms outside of humans, unfortunately. And so as wild and as far out as these concepts and conversations are, they need to be had, because that's the only way we can get even close to understanding. Because if it is true, and the evidence is suggested, the evidence is suggestive that they are, then it is our diligence to do so, because our biological function, remember I mentioned the respect principle earlier, is to respect each other. And yes, it is. Now that comes out of our empathy, which is a biological function. It is not just it's not some word that you can say, oh, empathy is a terrible thing. I mean, there's whole books about that crap. That's nonsense, right? That's like saying that the opposable thumb is a terrible thing. Well, maybe it is, but no, you get my point. We are at a stage as human beings where we are questioning so much of what we are, right? And I'm glad that we're at that stage, because that's gotten us out of the feudalism and many of the dictatorships or tyrannies, basically, that we lived under. We still have some, and then eventually more people will figure out, I mean, this is the thing. Yeah. What happens? You question democracy, whether democracy even works, or a republic or a monarchy even works. And look what happens when you do that. And yes, people are doing that, and they are coming up with the perfectly, logic isn't everything, right? Logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. Okay. But perfectly logical arguments as to why, no, really, if humans are to be free based upon their own biological principles, then anarchism is the way to go, right? But what happens is, and this is what I get worried about, and this is what we always want to fend off, is that most people just want to run with, well, either A, this is the way it's always been, which is a logical fallacy, by the way. And so that's the way to just keep going, or they are just lazy. And they just want to have things the way that their parents or grandparents have them, or blah, blah, blah. And they don't seize the opportunity to become something greater, or to develop something greater, or to live a better life. Yeah, I say it all the time lately, past few years, that we are living in a dystopia. While that is in my opinion, sad fact, okay, I don't think it's a matter of perspective. While that is a sad fact, at the same time, as more and more people realize that we live in a dystopia, my hope is that they have the desire to change that. And so there is the opportunity to come out of a dystopia being more knowledgeable and living in such a way that prevents you from falling into a dystopia again once you escape it. And that is entirely possible even right now. You can go and live in the cracks and get out of this shit. It's part of what we talk about a lot of times on this show. Granted, it's when we get into bigger subjects that, it's certainly not as simple as, well, boy, what web browser should we use this week? But then that's not why you're here. You're not just here for that anyway. You're here for so much more. But today, we are questioning so much, and it excites me when I see it, when people are willing to go there and have these really high level, big conversations. We have the opportunity to truly make our own lives, and that's all you can really control. But as each of our lives gets more and more free, I think it spreads like wildfire, and more of us, can have freer lives. But we've got to question everything. Talked about this on a recent Q&A. We've got to question everything, right down to, like the very heart of what makes civilization. You've got to go that far. What is life like? How can life be? What should it be? What is life? And then you start asking that about, again, mycelia. You start asking about the internet and so on. But this is the big stuff. And right now, while we have the opportunity, while we can be connected with each other and have some freedom of what the fuck we're saying to each other, let's have those conversations before, well, I don't think it'll ever be too late, but before it's too late. Anyway, that will do it for this episode of Sovryn Tech. Big stuff, but I think it's worthwhile to discuss. And we will have, maybe we need to revisit more of the conversation around mycelia at some point. But while it's an exciting idea that NASA has here, I think we need to, there are so many ethical questions to get into before we start laying a single goddamn thing on any other planetoid, right? Or, I mean, and I know we're already, putting probes and everything else, on varying celestial bodies, the moon, Mars. But I think we should have a better understanding of ourselves and of the other life, like mycelia, that we would take to these other worlds before we even go for it. But still, great idea. and again, let's try it out on Earth first, please. Anyway, talk about bringing in, getting out of dystopia. How about that? Cheap, really cheap housing. I know a lot of people would be excited about that one. And especially one that, well, oh man, I'm just like, I'm a man. You got to go to the link in the show notes because you got to see the video of this. I think it's stunning. I think it's beautiful. I love it. Looks very alien, but that's okay because tell me your city doesn't look boring or where you're around. So, all right, that's it for this episode of Sovryn Tech. We'll wrap this one up. We got another Sovryn Tech coming out very soon this week. And again, we're going to get into a huge conversation around tech and pandemics. That is coming, folks. And maybe we'll get into the Warren Buffett stuff. We'll see how it goes. But that'll wrap it up for this episode. I will see all of you on the other side.
Thank you for listening to Sovryn Tech, an Osiris One production. Now go out there and make some trouble.